down the volume a little bit. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Yeah, that's okay. I think we're okay. Tonight, inshallah ta'ala, we continue with the Seerah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, and last week we had stopped right at the end of the battle of Badr, or close to it at least. And I had taken some time and reflected on a few aspects of the last few lessons from the battle itself. Now, the aftermath of Badr was huge in Arabia in general. It was an earthquake that the ripples of it reached the whole peninsula and beyond. The story of it, the news of the loss that Quraysh suffered at the hands of the Muslims, of the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba, was just very, very surprising. It was rarely in life, in wars at least, do the underdogs get such an advantage. It doesn't happen very often. And when it does happen, it becomes an issue. It becomes food for chatter, and it's a type of talk that people enjoy engaging in. And the Quran talks about the day of Badr, and it calls it Yawm al-Furqan. This is the name of it. Yawm al-Taqal Jama'an is what it's called in the Quran. Furqan comes from the root of farq, and farq is difference, and al-Furqan is the thing that made the difference. That's how the derivative would be understood in Arabic. Al-Furqan, the thing that made the difference, which is why the Quran is called that. And the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of its names, the Quran al-Kareem, we call it Al-Furqan as well. Because it's the one thing that made the difference in terms of people understanding who they were and who they needed to be, and what they have to leave in terms of theologies or practices or values, and what they needed to adopt. And in terms of events in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, the Quran calls the day of Badr Yawm al-Furqan, the day where the difference was established. It made the difference. And the scholars would often say, Yawm farraq Allahu fihi bayn al-haqqi wal-batil, the day that the difference between haqq and batil became very clear. And I don't think it became clear as in haqq and batil were suspiciously similar beforehand. No, but rather from that moment forward in Arabia, you had to choose a side. Like you had to make a choice of who is it you're going to be supporting from now on. Is it going to be the people of al-haqq or the people of al-batil? Because before that, the Prophet ﷺ, and I find this to be an extremely interesting sociological approach that there may be some benefit to reflecting upon it. Is that prior to Badr, the Prophet ﷺ's movement was not well understood by the rest of the peninsula. It was not well known. It was not well established. And a lot of people living in Arabia at the time could have easily just said, he's a person who's seeking some fame, causing trouble, it's a big fitna, I don't want to get involved. They could afford to say, I don't want to get involved. Because it was the rumbling that was happening in Mecca was very low key. It was just between the Prophet and Quraysh, right? And then he goes to Medina, still just an immigration. The tribes have immigrated throughout the history of Arabia many times. Like the tribes in Arabia have always moved around. It's not something new. So up till then, it's still really not. But once the Prophet ﷺ took an army and battled another army and was victorious, you could not ignore him anymore, ﷺ. The people living in Arabia, they couldn't ignore it anymore. And when you can't ignore something, when something has that degree of establishment, now he has a country, and he has an army, and he has a constitution that is read and that was written by locals, read by locals, and signed by locals, and they have had a victorious day in war. For Arab, wars are known by days. Yawm al-Nakhil and Yawm Dhiqar wa Yawm, just days. They know it by days. They don't even call them, like we call them wars later on. We say Harb al-Basus and Harb Dahis wal-Ghabra. We call them names. We give the war a name. But the Arab didn't. There's Yawm Bu'ath. Even though the war was a 40-year war, they just talk about a day, like a day. And something happened that was significant on that day. Either a great warrior fell, or a great warrior was victorious or successful. Something happened of significance on that day. And Arab never really cared who won or who lost, as much as they cared who stood their ground. So if you could prove that you stood your ground, even though you lost the war, then that's a day that you would continuously or ongoingly be proud of, even if your army did not emerge victorious. If you ran away, even if your army won, then that would be a day of embarrassment for you, because it's just how they looked at things. And you'll find this a lot when you study the history of Arabia, that they cared about whether they could establish, they could prove that they were brave that day, right? And poets would be the ones who would kind of carry that along. It's just a very interesting dynamic that they had. On the day of Badr, not only did the army of the Prophet ﷺ establish itself as a well-organized one, not only was it diverse, meaning it had people from different backgrounds. You had people from Quraysh, and you had people from Al-Aws, and you had people from Al-Khazraj, and you had people from beyond all three who were Muslims and came in and joined, like Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, for example, and others. So you had people, even though we don't know if Abu Dharr was actually amongst the people of Badr or not, but I'm saying that within that army, it was quite diverse. And actually, just maybe less than 4 years or 3 years before, Al-Aws and Khazraj were at each other's necks. They weren't actually getting along. So the Prophet ﷺ established the presence of a well-trained, functional army, and he established the bravery of the people who stood by him, because that's what they were interested in. The Arab are interested in, who does he have? A bunch of missionaries, like a bunch of mercenaries, forgive me, people who just were there for the money, like they're paid to do this, so when it gets really, really difficult, they'll run away. Based on what are they? No, he was able to establish that he went with a smaller army, and they stood their ground longer. And Quraysh, technically that day, many of them ran. There was a lot of chaos in there. So it was a big day. It was a big day in the history of the peninsula. Meaning outside of understanding your deen, in the documentation of the Quran, obviously, for Arab, historically in their norms, the day of Badr was an important day, because something happened that day that had never happened before, where Quraysh, in all of its glory, was beaten outside of Mecca. Usually Quraysh stays and defends the Kaaba, but it went on a conquest, and when it goes on a conquest, it never loses. So it went on a conquest and it lost, and it lost to a very small group of, very small army, small group of people, newly established. Some of the people on the other side they were fighting were from their own, like were Qurayshiyyin. This became the water cooler rumors. These were people talked about. They talked about this, and the understanding of what occurred that day, and the stories of what occurred that day. It grew and it spread far and wide, and people start to ask, who is this new person? Who are these people who challenged Quraysh with a third of their numbers and emerged victorious? And what is this mix that they have? Again, if you study the Arabian history, you'll find that qaba'il fight each other, like tribes will fight other tribes. Even if the two tribes are cousin tribes, like Aws al-Khazraj or Bakr and Taghlib or other examples, they still are tribes. You don't find pieces of tribes coming up and gathering together, meaning the concept of war within the peninsula was not understood outside of the tribal system. Could you argue that maybe there was once or twice where the Arab came together to fight a foreign enemy? Maybe. But even then, it was still tribal. I mean, still it was tribes would take on certain parts of the army and function. The Prophet ﷺ didn't do that. He melted this group. On the day of Badr, you didn't have the 314 divided based on tribe. Right? On the day of Badr, you didn't have the Aws on the right and the Khazraj on the left and the Quraysh in the middle. No, none of that. It was actually not divided like that at all. People stood all amongst each other. It was as they do for prayer. For salah, for example, we don't start our salah, all right, Palestinians at the far right, left, and then the Egyptians beside them, and the Syrians beside them, and then we move on the Pakistanis. No, we don't do that. You stand, it's just whoever's in the masjid, whoever comes first, they stand together. This is our understanding of our deen, because we don't see it that way. We don't accept that type of segregation in our shara. So Badr, for Arab, was something that they had not seen before. This type of warfare was not something that they had witnessed and didn't understand. And he was victorious. You see, that's the piece that the Quran is pointing out. He won that day. Had he lost that day, then this whole thing would have been different. Khalas, yeah, a bunch of rebels, they went, they caused some trouble. Quraysh went and he took care of them, and it's over now. So you could afford not to even read about the story. Like you could easily, back then, you could afford not to need to know anything about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, him or his message or whatever happened there. But because he won that day, now you're forced. Now there is a force to be reckoned with. There's a force that exists in Arabia. It's new. They have a story. They have a problem. You need to know something about them. And you know something about them. At that point, you are forced to make a decision. Are you for what it is that they're calling for, or are you against it? Which is why it's called Yawm al-Furqan. It was the earthquake that shook all of Arabia. The ripple of it, basically knocked down every home within the whole region. And Quraysh was not unaware of that. Quraysh knew that this was the biggest catastrophe that has ever befallen them in their history. Mind you, Quraysh has been in many wars to defend the Kaaba and to defend themselves. Many, many wars. The Prophet ﷺ himself, in his own life as a young person, participated in at least one of them. So it's not like they don't know what they're doing. But the issue here is different. They were challenged by a new group, a group that is very diverse, a group that is fundamentally, theologically, ideologically refusing their status quo. See, tribes didn't have that. Two tribes would fight, but there's nothing fundamentally different. They're all tribes. They all worship the same couple of asnam. They all have the same mentality. It's more, you killed one of mine, so I'm going to erase your tribe off the face of the earth if I can. It's just an issue of revenge or avenging someone. But this was different. This was very different. What the Prophet ﷺ was bringing was not that. I'm not to avenge anybody. This is the right to believe something different. The right, your freedom of speech, your freedom of belief. Someone who was saying, I'm being oppressed, I'm not being given my right to speak my mind and to believe what I want. And I'm challenging your way of life. I'm challenging what you have believed to be the status quo and the norm and the right way to live for many, 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 many centuries. And I'm challenging it and saying that you're wrong and you need to change. That's big news. You're forced to listen to that. And because he won, he forced everyone's hand to listen. So people had to choose on his side or against him, alayhi salatu wasalam. And of course, the story began from that point. And it was called Yawm al-Furqan, the great day. A great day in the history of Islam. And he knew that, alayhi salatu wasalam. He stood there before this battle and he made dua. And he would say, Ya Rab, in tahlik hadhihi al-usbah, or hadhihi al-isaba, lan tu'bada fil ard. If this group of men fall today, then this is the end of the story. You'll never be worshipped on earth the way you deserve to be worshipped. And he would make dua to the point where the burda that's on his shoulders, alayhi salam, would fall off. And Abu Bakr would come and say, Hawwin alayka ya Rasulullah. Take it easy, O Prophet of Allah. فَإِنَّ رَبَّكَ مُبَلِّغُكَ مَا وَعَدَكَ. Your Lord will deliver for you that which He promised you. But the Prophet ﷺ did not know if that day things were going to work out or not. You and I know the day. It's easy, the story. We've heard the story, so you're naive. But he wasn't. He was ﷺ very, very obviously concerned that what if this doesn't work out? What if I had not prepared appropriately? What if I did make the wrong move here? There's always that questioning of your decisions when things are, when the stakes are that high. The stakes were very high on the day of Badr, which is why the people of Badr, those who stood there, were forever beloved and respected and trusted by the Prophet and by the Muslims until the day they passed away, and they had a certain status amongst their peers and amongst us as well. So that happened in Ramadan of the second year of Hijrah. Now, I don't usually talk about the fact that it was in Ramadan because I talk about it in Ramadan. And I usually share a little bit about Badr within Ramadan, regarding Ramadan. But it happened in Ramadan, and keep that in mind. On the 17th of Ramadan, this occurred. It was their first Ramadan. Say, well, what about the first year of Ramadan? No, it wasn't really Ramadan yet. The first year of his Hijrah, alayhi salatu wasalam, Ramadan was not prescribed as a faridah yet. So the concept of siyam has always existed historically, even amongst the Prophet ﷺ's teachings. But the concept of the month being mandatory and taraweeh and all that other beautiful stuff that come with it was made mandatory the second year of Hijrah. So the Sahaba were being told, okay, this is a part of your faridah. This is Bunya al-Islamu ala khams, and one of them is Sawm Ramadan. And he started teaching what Ramadan, this is the month that we're going to fast from first day to the last day, and then there's Eid after it, and you fast from dawn to sunrise to sunset, and you're going to have the salah at night and i'tikaf and all those other beautiful things. It's the night, it's the month of the Quran. Within it, Laylatul Qadr, the night that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ on in Ghar Hira. That night is being basically solidified as a very significant night till this day. So all of this is happening. The Sahaba are very happy about it, which explains to you why they didn't want to go to begin with. Remember I told you they didn't want to go. Like technically a lot of them were like, وَإِنَّ فَرِيقًا مِّنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ لَكَارِهُونَ. Many of the believers, they didn't want to go on this battle. Why do we go? Amongst the reasons wasn't just that they were doing well, it was Ramadan. And they were just learning to fast. And it was really nice. Ramadan's a beautiful time, even if you worry about it a little because of the fasting piece. But once you get used to the first 3 days of fasting, you're fine afterwards. And then you just enjoy the spirituality of it. You enjoy the beauty of the time itself and what it carries within it and the closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sense of community. And there's a lot of things in it. So they were enjoying it. The first 15 days had gone by, and the Prophet ﷺ said, no, we have to go and claim our rights. So they didn't want to. But they went, and they went fasting, and the majority of them stayed fasting. Scholars say the reason that they did is because the ahkam regarding rukhsa fil siyam had not been established yet. Meaning today, if you get on your car and you drive beyond the 80 kilometers, for example, then you can break your fast in Ramadan. Technically, you're allowed to do that. You make up for it after Ramadan, but you have the rukhsa if you're traveling or if you're sick. When you're going to war, it's the same thing. War is similar to travel or sickness or illness, the same thing. So you could break your fast, but the majority of them didn't because at that point the rukhsa was not yet described. Like it was not there yet as a hukum shar'i. So it was still the first year, and most of them were fasting when they fought this battle. So there's a lot for them in this experience that they had that day. Within the verses, and we'll talk about this in Uhud. I think I'll leave it till Uhud. So this happened at the end of the second year or the 9th month of the second year of Hijrah. The Battle of Uhud is going to happen in Shawwal of the 3rd year of Hijrah. So exactly a year and a month later. Almost exactly a year and a month later, the Uhud would happen. As I explained to you before, there's a lot that happens obviously between these battles. I don't always have the perfect historic record of exactly what happened in the 11th month of the second year, and the 12th month, and the first. I don't always have that. And if you do go to the books of Seerah, you may find some of them that will talk about certain events, but there's lack of evidence of the timing for it. So the way I do it is I'll tell you Badr and Uhud, the aftermath of Uhud and Khandaq, and then I'll talk to you a lot about social events that were happening in the midst of all of these years, just to make it a little bit easier. But between the 2nd and 3rd year of Hijrah, a lot of what was occurring was establishing the rituals of our deen. So Surah Al-Baqarah and parts of Surah An-Nisa and parts of Surah Al-Ma'idah and parts of all of Surah Al-Anfal, for example, all of Surah Al-Anfal was being revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. And these surah are the surahs in the Quran that established what the rituals would look like. Like they start to establish appropriately the jama'ah of salah, all 5 prayers with their timings, and the sunnahs that exist before them, and the sunnah of Jumu'ah, and establishing, obviously Ramadan, and establishing the amount that needs to be paid for zakah. And so these things started to be established within this period. So as the Prophet ﷺ is building up his followers in Medina, between Badr, after Badr, for the year after Badr, he's educating people, and people are attending, and they're learning, and the rituals are being established, and those who are accepting Islam now they have to start from zero, from scratch. They have to learn the values of the deen and the belief system of the deen, so that's what was happening for a lot of this period. Now we do have evidence that the Prophet ﷺ got married to Sauda bin Zam'a radiallahu anha during this period. So the Prophet ﷺ, mind you, up to this moment, was single or a widower. Because Khadija radiallahu anha passed away in the 10th year of Bi'athah, right after Hisar al-Shi'b, right after the boycott of the clan of Bani Hashim. So once it finished, she passed away. So he spent the rest of the 10th year, all of 11th year, 12th year, and 13th year of Bi'athah in Mecca without a wife, alayhi salatu wasalam. And then he went to Medina and spent the 1st year and the 2nd year also without a wife. But after Badr, we have evidence that he got married to Sauda bin Zam'a. Sauda radiallahu anha was an 85-year-old lady. She was the first widow within Islam regarding war. Her husband had fallen before Badr. This is the majority opinion, that he wasn't amongst the people of Badr, but before Badr he had fallen in one of the saraya, one of the conquests that he would send alayhi salatu wasalam with his Sahaba, and to honor her radiallahu anha. So all the marriages of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam after Khadija were godly commands, were divine commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. His wife, as in his wife as a man, someone, as Muhammad the man alayhi salatu wasalam, choosing a wife, it was Khadija. Hands down, from the beginning till the end. Till the day he died, alayhi salatu wasalam, he spoke of her. It was Khadija who he loved and Khadija who he remembered. The marriages that occurred after were marriages that had purposes. Had purposes not only for the region or just for the deen, but also for the ladies themselves. Because after Hijrah, the wife of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam had a name. She was called after that point al-Mu'mineen, the mother of believers. This gave her religious immunity, and it gave her political immunity. And this would be a big deal after he passed away, alayhi salatu wasalam. For Aisha and Hafsa and Salama and Juwayri and the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen that outlived him, alayhi salatu wasalam, would have a lot of impact on how the region would look and the role of ladies within Islam after he moved on, alayhi salatu wasalam. So these marriages after Khadija were all commands by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take this wife and take that wife. And the first lady he would marry is a lady who's obviously way beyond her years of caring about being married or not being married. Sauda bin Zam'a radiallahu anha al-Mu'mineen at the ripe age of 85 years old. Now when they talk about Uhud, they say it was for revenge, is what you find in some of the books. And to me, that's a little bit of it's an understatement for sure, to say the least. Uhud was much more than just revenge. Uhud was the acknowledgement from Quraysh that the Prophet ﷺ has established something that was getting too strong. Their reputation was what they were worried about the most. They had lost a lot of ground since Badr. Every month that went by after Badr, they lost more and more ground. And the Prophet ﷺ in his new city, his new country that it was established, was gaining more and more popularity. People were more interested in this. People were actually making their way to Medina to visit, just to see what is it that he established there, alayhi salatu wasalam. Is it true? Is it true that the Qurayshiyin are living in the homes of Al-Khazarija and the people of Aus? Is it true that they're actually living in the same homes? Is it true that there's a different system aside from the tribal one that is actually governing this? Because they couldn't believe it. It was something they had not seen before. So people who didn't really care about faith to begin with, and there's a lot of people who don't care about religion in life, unfortunately. They live that way. But they wanted to see what was this new establishment. And they would come back telling stories that, I'm not, but this is different. This is different. This is very different, a fresh breath of air. Everyone seems to be living there. You have this new faith, you have the mushrik, you have the Yahudi. They're all living in the same area. Everyone is being treated. It was something of great interest for people. He was becoming more popular. And the converts, the reverts, people coming into Islam, the numbers were ramping up slowly but surely. And his army was getting stronger, alayhi salatu wasalam. Not in numbers, but in faith and in commitment. And Quraysh was losing face. So they had to try something. So they had to try something. So they kept on provoking the Muslims until they basically pushed their way. They gave themselves a reasoning for it, and they accused Muslims of harming a caravan, something that had nothing, propaganda that none of it occurred. The Muslims wouldn't hide there was no reason for the Prophet ﷺ to hide any of his intentions when he wanted to do something. And they would move out of Mecca in Shawwal right after Ramadan with 3,000 warriors this time. They tripled their army from the day of Badr. And the reason that they did this was because they had to save face. They could not afford to allow the story of Badr to be the last thing that people remember about the clash between the two forces. So they needed to go and they needed to set the record straight. So the Prophet ﷺ in Ramadan, he would see a ru'ya. He would tell his Sahaba about it after Fajr on one morning, within Ramadan, right, a couple of weeks before Uhud. And he would tell them, رَأَيْتُ يَدِي فِي دِرْعٍ حَصِينَةٍ وَرَأَيْتُ بَقَرًا تُذْبَحْ وَرَأَيْتُ ثُلْمَةً فِي دِرْعِي. He said, I see cattle being slaughtered, a number of cows being slaughtered. And I see myself in a very protected dir'a, meaning a dir'a is a shield. I mean, I saw myself in a protected shield. But then I saw in my shield there was going to be a crack. Like a piece of my shield is going to fly off. It's going to be broken or destroyed. So they asked him, مَا تَأْوِيلُكَ لَهَا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ what do you, what's your ta'weel? And he didn't tell them. He refused to tell them how he understood it. He only told a couple of the very close trusted Sahaba. So he only told Abu Bakr and Umar, just a couple of people who were close by. He didn't want to actually explain this ru'ya. The reason being is that he knew alayhi salatu wasalam what Quraysh was up to. His intelligence, his groups of intelligence, they were there. And they were giving him all of the information alayhi salatu wasalam, what Quraysh is preparing, what they're working on. So he knew alayhi salatu wasalam what was actually happening. He knew that Quraysh was close to completing putting together a 3,000 man army, which is 3 times the number of people they fought last time around. So he knew that, and he knew that the intention was to come and set the record straight from what happened on the day of Badr. So he knew this was coming, and as he's thinking about this, he sees this ru'ya. So he knows that this vision that he's seeing in his dream has something to do with the battle that's going to come, but he didn't want to say anything. And for a very good reason he didn't want to say anything, alayhi salatu wasalam. The reason being is that he wanted to ask people what to do. And his vision within it had a suggestion of what people should do. So he didn't want to influence people's opinion. So he only told a couple of the close Sahaba to him, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali, some people who were entrusted, and not the whole congregation. And the group that what his ta'weel of it was, his explanation or his interpretation of his dream or his vision, was the Baqar Tuzba, that some of the Sahaba were going to pass the battle, some of the Sahaba were going to fall that day, some people that he loved. And the thulma, meaning the piece that's going to fly off of his shield, is that he's going to lose someone very dear to him. He's going to, amongst the losses, there's going to be something that's going to be like a crack in his shield, something that will forever harm him. He'll never, it'll always be there. Like every time he looks at his shield, that crack is going to be there. So he knew something was coming. And the dir'a hasina, he was sitting in a protected, shielded area. He interpreted that as Medina. So he didn't tell people the ta'weel of this, because if he did, then what he's saying really is that based on my vision, we should stay in Medina for this battle. And that is a decision that the congregation had to make, like the ummah had to make. And he didn't want to influence with his own vision, alayhi salatu wasalam. So he didn't tell them. And he just asked them for the second time, Ashiru alayya ayyuhan nas. Oh people, grant me your wisdom or your consultation. So they asked him what was happening, and the Prophet ﷺ told them, based on Sa'id ibn Zayd and Talha, Ibn Ubaydillah and Zubayr, the intelligence groups that we have, they are on their way. By the 3rd or 4th day of Eid, that's Uhud happened like on some scholars put it at the 3rd day of Eid, not that you have 3 days. So for Ramadan, it's just 1 day of Eid, by the way. Like for Eid al-Adha, you have a couple of days. You have Eid al-Adha and then the 3 days of Tashriq. So you can call them the first day of Eid, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th day of Eid. You can use that terminology, no big deal. But for Ramadan, it's just 1 day of Eid. You can't say 2nd and 3rd. We just do that to make kids feel happy that you have 2 or 3 days of Eid. But really, it's just 1 day of Eid. So the Battle of Uhud was just right after Eid. So people, you rejoice on the day of Eid. It's a beautiful time. It's a beautiful time. So it was going to happen right after, which is obviously not great. So the Prophet ﷺ told them they're on their way. We have 2 options. Either we go and we meet them out like we did on the day of Badr, and that was risky. They all acknowledged. Again, they would learn the lessons. When you read Surah Al-Anfal, Allah says, إِذْ أَنْتُمْ بِالْعُدْوَةِ الدُّنْيَا وَهُمْ بِالْعُدْوَةِ الْقُصْوَى. I recited the verses to you, where Allah says, you guys were in the right place. What Allah is saying is that it was very risky. It could have easily been the opposite. You were in the other udwa, then the right, and then you would have lost that day. But we set it up for you. So not only is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishing His bounty upon them, but also saying it was risky being outside. Being outside of Medina when you're outnumbered is a risky move. Think about it well before you do it, because if you don't have the right plan for it, you can end up outnumbered and in a disadvantage. So they had learned from these verses and from what occurred that day that being outside, like going out and getting caught in the middle of the desert or caught outside of your city, is a risky thing. Most of the wars between Arabs would occur within the city of the other. That's why there were qila', a lot of castles, and people would stay behind the walls of their castles. And not just in Arabia, by the way, that's all over the world. Because sieges are hard. If you set a siege around a castle, if they have a lot of provision on the inside and it rains a couple of nights in a row, the army on the outside gets very ill and gets very tired, and they end up losing the siege. They have to leave because they can't maintain it anymore. So meeting out in the open is a gutsy move. It's never actually recommended. So people who were seasoned in war said, no, Ya Rasulullah, we stay in Medina. And amongst the wordings, by the way, that you have in the books of Seerah for this, narrations from the Prophet ﷺ himself and some from the Sahaba, is that we would stay in Medina, and that way, فَنَحْتَمِي بِأَسْوَارِهَا وَتُعِينُنَا النِّسَاءُ وَالصِّبْيَانُ مِنْ عَلَى أَسْقُفِ الْمَنَازِلِ. And the ladies and their children would help us from the rooftops. So the ladies would participate. This was a part of the plan, that we would have our warriors on the ground, we would hold our city, and then the ladies would help us from the rooftops with archery and with rocks and whatever they could help us with. But the problem was that the majority of his congregation, alayhi salatu wasalam, and it's a beautiful thing actually, were younger people. Were people in their 20s. And most of them did not attend Badr. Most of them weren't there for the day of Badr. And it gnawed at them. Like it bothered them heavily that they weren't there for the day of Badr, because they lost out on this critical, crucial, monumental moment. If not for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but just for the sake of fame. Like even if just for a young person, sometimes you want to be there when it matters. And all of Arabia is talking about Yawm Badr, the day of Badr, of what happened. And you weren't there. And you were with him, alayhi salam. You just weren't there that morning. The day that he decided that we're going to get the caravan, you just were away, or you just didn't attend, or whatever happened. So a lot of the younger people were very disappointed that they were not there that day. They didn't like it. So they said, Ya Rasulullah, nakhruj wa nuqatiluhum. We go and we fight them like we did on the day of Badr. Because they're a little bit, the young blood is always a little bit more passionate. They're a little bit more enthusiastic, right? A little bit more gutsy. They want to go out. All of the older Sahaba are like, no, we stay in Medina. Not because of his vision, alayhi salatu wasalam, at all. Just based on simple wisdom, just a little bit of experience. Their wars, it's all the same. You don't go out in the open, especially if you're outnumbered. They're coming to us with 3,000 people. We're 1,000 at best. We're 1,000 at best. We're going to go, we're outnumbered again, 3-1. Why repeat the same scenario of Badr again? We got, not lucky, but we got tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the day of Badr. What if this, no, we shouldn't just go out. We stay in Medina. We're more likely to be able to push them back and defeat them if we stay in our city and utilize the fact that we know our city, that it's well protected, and that we have the ladies to help us so the numbers go up. So it's a better idea. There's more wisdom in it. But the shabab outnumbered the elderly. They outnumbered them by a lot. He put it for a vote, alayhi salatu wasalam, and he was outnumbered by quite a bit. So the Prophet ﷺ said, all right, then as agreed, we will go out for the battle. So he goes home, ﷺ, and he starts dressing himself for the war. War is a horrible thing. We don't celebrate it. We don't celebrate war. None of the stories that I'm telling you are designed to celebrate the concept of war, ever. War is a horrible thing. And if you don't think war is horrible, it's because you have not witnessed it. If you were to witness war for a day, then you'll understand how horrible it is. It's a time of fear. It's a time of pain. It's a time where countries suffer, where the weak suffer the most. It's a very difficult thing to undergo. So we don't celebrate that. What we celebrate in these stories is the bravery of the people whom we look up to. The bravery of our role models, of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba who were with him. That even though they had to do this, they didn't want to, but they had to do it. They did it with bravery. Even though war is the worst thing possible, when they needed to do it, when they were forced to do it, they went and they did it. This is in the Quran talks about this quite. أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ قِيلَ لَهُمْ كُفُّوا أَيْدِيَكُمْ وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ. Take a look. Have you not seen the example of the people? He's speaking about the Sahaba here, subhanahu wa ta'ala, in Surah An-Nisa. When they were told, كُفُّوا أَيْدِيَكُمْ, hold your hands, you're not allowed to initiate war or cause any physical. This is in Mecca. In Mecca, you're not allowed to don't carry sword. Hold your hand back. وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ. But rather focus on your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and aiding the poor and taking care of people. فَلَمَّا كُتِبَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْقِتَالُ إِذَا فَرِيقٌ مِّنْهُمْ يَخْشَوْنَ النَّاسَ كَخَشْيَةِ اللَّهِ أَوْ أَشَدَّ خَشْيَةً. When the war or combat or battle was made mandatory, that you have to fight back, a group of them, a small group, the munafiqeen, they start saying, why did you make this? They start fearing people more than they fear Allah. وَقَالُوا, and they would say, لِمَ كَتَبْتَ عَلَيْنَا الْقِتَالِ. Why did you make this mandatory upon us? لَوْلَا أَخَّرْتَنَا إِلَىٰ أَجَلٍ قَرِيبٍ. Could you not have, just postponed this? Maybe you just protect us yourself instead of making us fight. قُلْ مَتَاعُ الدُّنْيَا قَلِيلٌ وَالْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لِمَنِ اتَّقَى وَلَا تُظْلَمُونَ فَتِيلًا. Say, dunya is short anyways, and akhirah is better, so stand your ground and be brave. The Quran was always, if you read the Quran is always trying to convince the Sahaba that you and the people with the Prophet ﷺ, that you have to stand your ground when needed. You have to be brave, even though no one wants to, but you have to be brave. I have to be brave. So they did. So the Prophet ﷺ is in his house. He's getting dressed. He's preparing his war gear. When he walks away with the decision made, but a bunch of people stay back, not satisfied. Why are we going out? Well, you were outnumbered in the vote. Yeah, but the majority of those who voted to go out are a bunch of teenagers and 20-year-olds. What do they know? They know nothing. Why are they even voting? Why don't they just listen to the people who know? So this became an argument piece. People were getting upset. And then one of the Sahaba who the Prophet ﷺ told the vision to, let it go. He said, by the way, guys, just so you know, the guys who were so enthusiastic to go fight outside, he saw a vision, ﷺ, that he was supposed to stay in Medina, and you guys voted against this. So now the younger people are like, what? We didn't know that. So they go running to his house, ﷺ, they knock on his door. He opens his door, he's half dressed for his gear. He has his upper gear on. And he opens the door, and there's like 200 young men standing out the door. What do you want? فَقَالُوا يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ كَأَنَّنَا أَكْرَهْنَاكَ. Have we coerced you to do something we didn't want to do? Like, are we out of line? This is their adab, radiallahu anhu, out of adab. Did we say something we shouldn't have said? Did we make a decision? Did we force you to make a decision that you didn't want to make? We didn't know. فقال يا رسول الله إن كان يرضيك أن نبقى في المدينة بقينا. If it pleases you to stay in Medina, we stay in Medina as you want. فقال عليه الصلاة والسلام ما كان لنبي إذا لبس لأمة الحرب أن يضعها حتى يقاتل أو حتى يفصل الله بينه وبين عدوه. No. It's unacceptable. I've worn my gear. There's no excuse for a prophet to wear his gear with the intention of going to fight for the sake of Allah, and then he decides not to in the middle of it, or he changes his mind. Right? We agreed. We're ready. I'm going. There's a lesson in this piece that we're going to take some time and talk about at the end of the battle of Uhud that is worthy of contemplation, especially these days, for sure. But I'm going to give you a sneak peek of it now, just so you can think about it. The outcome of this war is not going to be in the favor of the Muslims. It's not. And some people are going to use that as an argument to say, well, you put it to a vote and you involved the youth, and you shouldn't have. That was their argument to him. The Quran would be revealed to him, alayhi salatu wasalam, after Uhud, and it would state clearly, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. And we're going to read these verses in depth. And continue to consult with them as you move forward. Taking away the idea or the possibility that consulting with his congregation, alayhi salatu wasalam, was ever optional. It was never optional. This is what he was going to always do. Even though the outcome was negative, he was not permitted, alayhi salatu wasalam, to say, well, I asked you once, it failed, take a back seat, please, from now on. Listen from your, no. And this is in war. This is in war. War, ya ammi, war. Not in some program that you wanted to start in a tertiary masjid in some city that no one has heard of. No, this is in war. That war that was going to affect the future of Islam as a whole. And people were still, no. You asked them their opinion, they gave it. It doesn't matter whether it worked or it didn't. You're going to do this again. The idea of, no, we have to put them aside because they're younger or they know less or they're not. No, this is Islamically unacceptable. Not only should masajid and should the ummah empower the younger generation to make decisions and to come up with plans and to try things, But they have to be okay with that when they do that and fail, to allow them to try again and again and again. Because it's normal that if you try something and you do something that's a little bit innovative, you have a little bit of ibda', a little bit of creativity, that you're going to fail a couple of times. Who said that it's a one-strike deal and you're out? I'm going to give you one shot at getting this done. If it doesn't work, then you're out. Who said this? Who came up with this silly rule? If in war, because I would accept an exception for war, by the way. Like, my mind would be okay with that. My mind would be okay with saying, well, consult with the youth and let them make decisions, but not in war, because war is, it's life and death. No, I would be okay with that. I personally would say that makes sense to me. The Quran, no. Even in war, you're going to consult and you're going to go by the majority, and if they make a mistake, then that's how it is. And you try again. And to me, that's an indication of the mentality that we are obligated to carry as Muslims within our deen. That as you rise, as you move through life and you rise up the rankings as a person, you go into your 40s and your 50s and your 60s, you have more. It's your obligation, not an option. You don't deserve applause for this. It's your obligation to empower the people who are coming after you, and to advise them, and to let them fail, and to help them learn and let them try again. This is so rare that when it happens, we're so impressed by the person who does it. It's not optional. It never was. It never was. This is the least that you can do. If Rasulullah alayhi salatu wasalam said this, before war, if he saw, what, you're more wise than him alayhi salatu wasalam. Your wisdom is better than his vision, alayhi salatu, his ru'ya at night when he saw that he had to stay in Medina. He saw it in he's a prophet, he's not a guy, just some person. He's the Rasulullah who saw a vision, a ru'ya, not some adghath ahlam, some weird dream. He saw a vision that he should stay in Medina. But the majority, the youth, want to get up. We go out. Because how else do you empower them? How else do you make sure that they matter, and their voices matter, and their feelings matter, and their opinion matters? That's how. I am not more wise than him, alayhi salatu wasalam. I don't have more authority than him. I have no reason. If he allowed for this, then who am I? Who am I to dare hold that back from people who are coming up? Who am I to judge them when it doesn't work out? Who am I to threaten to hold it off as if it's something that I own? It's my decision. It's not my decision. It never was. It's not optional. Masajid that function through this old hierarchy, this just, I don't know how to put this in a way that's not going to come off. Islamic institutions that function that way are doomed. They're going to fail. They're going to fail. Because if you get, what was it that about the Prophet ﷺ and his movement that was most interesting? It was the number of the youth that existed. You know that the number is high just from the vote of the day of Uhud. You just know that they outnumbered people by far. They had status, they had position, because the tribal system doesn't allow for that. The tribal system is based on seniority. That's pretty much it. That's why people who of young age, who did not have the good fortune of their elders dying early, where they could come in and take a position, were forced to do something different. They had to get out of politics. That's why when you study Arabic history, you find that these umara, these princes, were wasting their lives drinking and partying. And the reason being is that there's nothing else to do. The grandfathered in hierarchy of people was not going to allow anyone to penetrate into this group unless there was going to be a pet, unless they were going to behave as pets to the older people and listen to the old geezers, whatever they had to say. So that's why the majority of Arabian princes, even in modern day media and in Hollywood, they're depicted as people who are just living lavish lifestyles, eating and drinking and playing and wasting their lives. Why? Even though they're very capable, it's because of this. It's because of this very toxic mindset in running things, where you're not senior, sit aside, be quiet. If you want to get involved, then you have to become someone's pet. And this is a very important piece of understanding how he did things, alayhi salatu wasalam. It wasn't like that. In war, he listened to them. I would have been okay if he didn't listen to them in war. I would have been okay him establishing all of this outside of war and making war the one exception because lives are going to fall. No. He was going to do it in war, alayhi salatu wasalam. For this, to stand as an example that you will continue to point at till the day of judgment, that you cannot miss it. You can't miss it. More than that. I'm going to go one step more than that because that may not be enough for you. Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul got so upset. He is the leader of Al-Khazraj. And this poor gentleman, well, I shouldn't say poor, but I feel a certain, when I think about it, you have to understand his story. Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul is the worst of the munafiqeen. And he is going to be punished on the day of judgment with that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees fit for him. But this gentleman, right before the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, was being prepared to rule the city. To rule the city. And based on a lot of stories and a lot of things that happened beforehand. So he was already very disgruntled with the presence of the Muslims, and he was really not committed to the idea, but he couldn't afford to break off. He signed the constitution, he was technically a Muslim. But he looked for any opportunity to divide this group that he was a part of, hoping that this group would fall to pieces at some point. So when the Prophet ﷺ took a vote and didn't just come and ask him and the elders, he got very offended. He got very offended. قال يسمع الغلمان ويتبع الغلمان ويتركني. He listens to these kids and he leaves me. I was the leader on the day of Bu'ath. I was the commander who ended who was victorious on the day of a very famous day amongst the days of the war of Arabian wars. So he got so upset that he commanded the 300 people who listened to him to not join the army. So the army that was 1,000 people going to fight at 3,000 went from 1,000 to 700 overnight because of this decision. Now at that point I would have been okay with, I'm totally okay now with the Prophet ﷺ. All right, we stay in Medina, we'll continue to listen to the Shabab, we will completely empower you, but maybe just not for this day specifically. No, kept on going. There was a consequence to this decision. The consequence of actually putting it to a vote and involving people had a consequence that was detrimental. He lost a third almost of his army. A third of his army. An army that was already outnumbered 1-3 was now going to be outnumbered 1-4. This is what was going to happen on the day of Uhud. And of course, Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul that day, up to that time, every time the Prophet ﷺ gave a khutbah Jumu'ah, I'll explain to you the dynamic here. Before he, you know how the Imam says, Assalamu alaikum, sits down, and then, so when the Prophet ﷺ would say Assalamu alaikum, and then sit down for a moment, he would stand up, he would turn to the congregation, and he would say, Ya ayyuhan nas, hada Rasulullah, isma'uhu wattabi'uhu. He would stand up and say, oh people, this is the Prophet of God, listen to him and follow him. He gave himself a little bit of a status where he could speak. The Prophet ﷺ allowed for it. He had no problem. He never told him to sit down. He was allowed, he was never told later on, took aside, maybe stop doing this. No, for over 2 years or 2 full years, and the third year, half of the third year, this happened every Jumu'ah. Imagine being in the masjid of the Prophet ﷺ during the beginning of the third year of Hijrah, and you're attending the khutbah, and some guy stands up in the middle of before the khutbah and starts telling you that you should listen to the Prophet ﷺ. Very weird. But the Prophet ﷺ understood, like he felt for this guy. He felt for what the loss that he went through. He understood. The Prophet ﷺ was very sensitive, a very sensitive soul. He knew the difficulty of what Abdullah bin Ubay bin Salul was dealing with. The difficulty of accepting that he was no longer going to be the alpha. That he was no longer going to be the king. He was not going to rule anymore. Right? That's hard to swallow. Especially when you're that close. You're that close to becoming a king. A king. He was going to be a king. Fil Arab, there are different ranks. Right? You only use the word king if you are ruling more than just your tribe. If you're just your tribe, you're not called a king. And Al-Arab had muluk. Himyar wa Kinda wa Al-Ghasasiyah wa Manazira, you had kings because they ruled more than just their own tribes. So he was going to become a king because he's going to rule Khazraj and Aus, so it's not just his tribe. And that was pulled from under him. So the Prophet ﷺ let a lot go. But the day he took back the 300, after Uhud, once the Prophet ﷺ got on the minbar for the first Jumu'ah, he stood up, the Prophet ﷺ told him, Ijlis, sit down. No, you don't get to do this anymore. You don't get to pull back 300 fighters before the night of the battle and then stand up and do this, not anymore. So he sat down. He didn't allow it for it. ﷺ was not a pushover, right? He was very wise. And he was very merciful, but he had to draw lines. He couldn't allow for this man to continue to speak the way he did after what he did. after doing that, after deciding the night before the battle that he was going to withhold a third of his army, the Prophet ﷺ's army, that was a big deal. Some of the people who were held back were not necessarily bad people. Some of the people who stayed back later on became very good Muslims. But the day that they were told by their leader, see, it was very confusing for a lot of these new Muslims. Who do they listen to? Because they're used to a certain way of things running. This is the leader of our tribe. For as long as I remembered, he's been the leader of our tribe. And he's my second uncle or my third grandfather or my stepdad or whatever. He's related to me. So it's hard for me to say no to him. So even though I love Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, sometimes he can get confused. So some of those 300 that stayed back were actually not bad people. They just didn't know what else to do when they were told this by their leader and they stayed back. Of course, they would later on make up for it in other battles. Yeah. But this was a big deal. So Abdullah ibn Ubay bin Salul just tilted an already unbalanced battle. He made it less balanced. 1 to 3 is already pretty bad. Now it's 1 to 4. And it's out in the open. And there's a little bit of turmoil amongst the Sahaba. Should we? Even the guys who said, let's go out, are now like, should we have not done this? Should we have said we should stay home? The Prophet ﷺ would go and establish the place, depending on where the mushrikeen were headed. The Prophet ﷺ would choose an area for this battle to occur. A little bit outside of Medina. Today it's not outside of Medina, it's in Medina. But Medina today is much bigger than it was during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So Uhud at that time technically was outside of Medina, just so you understand how it works. So he would go ﷺ, he would meet the mushrikeen beside Jabal Uhud. The reason he would choose Jabal Uhud, because similarly to the day of Badr, he had an idea ﷺ, that if he can force the opposite army to fight him in a narrow area, then the advantage of their numbers becomes less applicable. Like they can't cash in on the advantage of numbers anymore. If 50 is standing in front of 100, but the hallway can only take 25, then really the 100 doesn't have that advantage anymore. If the people who are standing the 25 up front are good, then they can basically steamroll the 100 because they lost the ability to flank. Really, if most people here play some form of video games, so flanking is a big thing when you're fighting. It's very helpful because if the guy can't see you, they can't really do anything about it. And Arab karr wa far, that's how they did their wars. And flanking was what you used if you had a number advantage. If you were way more, then you tried to surround your enemy. So if you're a couple of thousands and they're a couple of hundreds, it's very easy. So now they have to fight in every direction. So their numbers become less and you dilute them, so it's easier. So the Prophet ﷺ's idea was that he was going to force them into a very small area to fight. And I think I have a picture of it. Okay, so you can see up there. So the Prophet ﷺ positioned his army between the mountain of Uhud, which is a big mountain, and a smaller mountain that today is called Jabal al-Rumah because of the archers that were on it. Rumah is the plural of archers, so the mount of archers. But at that time, it didn't have a name. It was just a mountain that was high enough. It was around 23 kilometers to go around. So 23 kilometers on horseback takes a bit of time. It's not something you're going to get through a couple of minutes. So if the Prophet ﷺ had the first Muslim on the right side standing at the beginning of Uhud, and the last person on the left side standing right at the amount of archers, so the only way that and that's not enough for 700 people, that distance can only fit maybe 200 people at tops, or 250. So now the army of the mushrikeen have to come in 250 at a time instead of all 3,000 coming in. So the only way for them to cash in on their advantage and to benefit is to flank. They can't flank from Uhud. Uhud's way too big. Uhud will take forever. It'll be the next day before they can make it around. The only way is to flank from around the mount, this small mountain, this small mount. So his plan, alayhi salatu wasalam, was to put 50 well-trained archers on that mount. Their only job was to, you see where that blue is, to make sure whoever tries to go in the blue area there, to take them out. to basically end the advantage, because unless it was going to be cavalry, then it's not going to work, because it took too long to go around. The way that the mushrikeen or the Quraysh would benefit is if they went around and went up the mountain and then came down upon the Muslims on the side. To go around from the whole thing it takes too long. I don't think this is. When you look at the pictures, you don't always have great pictures. I don't have a better picture. It's not fully accurate because they didn't go around. That's not what happened on the day of Uhud. They ended up going over the mountain. Like they came to the side and went over the mountain. Going around the mountain takes too long. So that was his plan, alayhi salatu wasalam, and they had agreed amongst themselves that this was going to be the case. So he put on the mountain 50 people. The leader is a sahabi by the name of Abdullah ibn Jubayr, radiyallahu anhu. And he was responsible for running this the plan. And the plan was very clear. The Prophet ﷺ very clearly stated the following. He said, look, إِذَا رَأَيْتُمُونَ انتصرنا أو رأيتمونا متنا وأكلنا الدود فلا ينزلن أحد منكم حتى آمره. Whether you see us victorious, celebrating our victory, or you see us all dead and we're being eaten by worms, don't move from this mountain unless I personally tell you so. So if I die, you die on the mountain. This is the command. This is the commander of the army. As a commander of the army, if I die, then you're going to die on this mountain. You're not going to move from this mountain because you won't move until I tell you to move. Clear? Everyone's clear. Abdullah ibn Jubayr, he takes this message. He makes sure it's absolutely clear. He prepares the 50 archers is a lot. 50 archers, well-trained archers. The Arabian bow is similar to the English bow, not like the French one. French bows are smaller, so you get more frequency. They don't go as far, but you get more frequency. You're able to throw more. The English bows are a bit bigger. The Arabian bow is maybe half a size bigger than the English bow. I once went to a friend of my father's who had memorabilia of this type of this sort, and he showed me an Arabian bow, and I was maybe 13 at the time, and I could not even move it. Like you're supposed to be able to hold the bow and then pull it back, right? I couldn't move it well. I couldn't move it at all. I know I'm a little bit of a wimp, but not to the point where I couldn't move it at all. Like I couldn't actually do anything with it. It was so difficult. And the old brother who owned it, he took it and he pulled it back a little bit. He wasn't able to pull the whole thing back. So imagining like what this actually. So if you get a person who knows what they're doing, and he took me, and there's a Bedouin man who uses these Arabian bows, and I watched him actually put the arrow, and the arrow, forgive me, is quite like it's around a meter long, and he pulls it back, and when he lets it go, it has force. You're talking about something that will penetrate a wall very easily. Like this will go right through a horse, no problem. So these bows and these arrows were very, very powerful. So having 50 well-trained archers on that mountain was actually it was an important piece, and they were properly shielded from the archers of the enemy. And this was the game plan. This was the battle layout for the Battle of Uhud. We'll end with that, inshallah ta'ala. We'll continue next week. Subhanakallah bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakumullah khair.
Are you leading, inshallah?